So now it's time for the Q&A as I slyly slide over here for my extremely high-tech piece of paper. I'm gonna cheat, and I have another opening question, and then we'll immediately go to things, which is that I'm just gonna ask you each to comment on infighting. Comment on infighting among environmentalists, either at a political level between different parties that all want to work on the environment but can't seem to agree on anything, and then perhaps just at an individual and organizational level when we can't seem to get people on different specific issues to work all together. I feel like this would have happened already if we had.
This is when we break out into a mud fight, and I start pulling on her hair. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I don't think that's the problem, with all due respect. You can't blame the environmental movement for the fact that some of the wealthiest corporations on earth have combined their resources to create a massive disinformation campaign to tell enough people that there isn't clear science on the climate crisis to allow the worst actors in government to do their dirty work for them. 80% of Canadians accept climate science and want to see climate action. Now, I will say, not to talk about environmental groups, because I had a lot of experience with environmental groups, and I never saw that as a problem. I was part of the Climate Action Network. Sierra Club worked with all the other groups. The Canadian versions of all the groups you'll see on the screen later have always worked well together to try to get climate action. It's not always easy. We have different approaches. In political life, I totally agree that the first-past-the-post voting system creates an incentive for parties that should be able to work with each other to find fault and to, and the worst of it is that first-past-the-post voting system actually creates an incentive to keep climate off the agenda, because it's one of those issues that if you're in the Liberals or the NDP, you're worried about strategic voting, so you don't want to talk about climate too much because that makes people more fearful of Harper, as opposed to, so that the fear of Harper drives strategic voting, which most parties on the left worry about, because the first-past-the-post voting system, as eventually did happen, allows a party that gets 39% of the popular vote to form a majority government. We're the only party right now that is pushing as hard as we can for cooperation in the House of Commons and in future elections. But again, that's not, the reason we haven't seen climate action isn't because of infighting. It's because we have been up against really large odds, and we need the kind of citizens movement that Bill McGibbon and 350.org and environmental groups are trying to start. So I hope it's not an inadequate response, but I just don't think that's been the problem, and I don't think there's been very much of it.
I mean, you're obviously immersed, you coming from Sierra Club, and you're full on the ground, but just from my vantage point, I see it more as almost an American problem and less of a Canadian problem. I mean, in terms of the environmental groups that I've dealt with here in Canada, I think it's less of an issue than you see in the States, where there's been, attack from one environmental organ against another and that kind of thing. So I think we've risen above that here, which is kind of nice.
And another big difference between Canada and the U.S., when we got Kyoto ratified, which of course does seem an awfully long time ago because of the horror of seeing us legally withdraw. It's the first treaty in the history of Canada from which we've ever legally withdrawn. But getting it ratified in Canada, which didn't happen in the States, was largely because not only did we have cohesion within the environmental movement, but we had effective outreach and strong networks with the labor unions in Canada, with the church groups in Canada, with municipalities across Canada. So we had a very effective working on the ground network that pushed for ratification, and we got ratification when Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister. It had not occurred to me at that moment that we were celebrating ratification that both Canada would pull out of trying to reach targets, which is what Harper did in 2006, and that he would legally withdraw Canada from Kyoto, which was accomplished in 2012, which is one of the larger tragedies of my lifetime as a Canadian.
So one of the audience questions was, how do you effectively put pressure on a federal majority that doesn't care about tar sands?
Stephen Harper isn't going to be moved on this, but that doesn't mean that members of his caucus aren't concerned. Since becoming elected as a member of Parliament, I worked with others to form a cross-party climate change caucus. We meet regularly. We meet without reporters in the room. All MPs and senators are invited. There are conservatives who attend. We give climate briefings. We try to get everyone to pay attention. The reality is that Stephen Harper has all the power in this particular administration. We've been veering towards prime ministers that have all the power for some time. It's just that he's exercised more of it than any prime minister ever has in the past. So there's effectively no cabinet government. There's just Stephen Harper. There really is no Conservative caucus. There's just Stephen Harper. So what we do now is that we need to have a very, very active citizens movement to ensure that that all members of Parliament get the message that this matters, and don't take it for granted that the NDP would make it a priority or the Liberals would make it a priority unless they're pushed. It's one thing to say the right things, but to consistently focus on this issue, I wish I had more support in the House to consistently focus on this issue so that we could make progress. But the bottom line is, don't wait till Harper's gone and there's a new prime minister in there. We got to organize, 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 and 350.org's divestment campaign gives us good tools right now, and educating everyone you know, so that when you're going to somebody's house for dinner, or you're going to run into people at work, I mean, literally, after seeing this film, see if you can't find ways to engage people in conversation and make sure they've got climate science information, that they understand the issue, and they're willing to join with you, for instance, in coming to the rally on Saturday. When there are rallies, show up. And another thing, very briefly, because Darren mentioned about how newspapers are going under, but most of the mainstream newspapers in this country is still where most people go for their information. We've got to use those letters to the editor sections, 300 to 400 word letters to the editor, if published. It's the most read section of any newspaper is the letters section, and it educates the people who read the letter. Plus, the politicians who aren't paying attention to the issue get those letters put on their desk every morning. The letters that are published across Canada end up in a pile of clippings for every minister if it relates to their portfolio, and it does affect public opinion to get letters published. Oh, and to monitor those crazy website comment sections which are anonymous, because those are places just absolutely infiltrated with trolls trying to convince Canadians that there's doubt about climate science. Please help those sites protect the smart comments, defend people who need defending, and post your own thoughts. Sorry for taking slow with that. Yeah.
No, I think you pretty much said it all on that. And I think that, just to reiterate what you're saying, you know, just because I know I'm always encouraging people to contact their MPs and I in my books I give, you know, the Prime Minister's email address, and even if it's falling on deaf ears with the Prime Minister, you must, as Elizabeth said, continue to contact the MPs across this country and remind them that this is a voting issue. And it feels like, you know, you might get the automatic response, no one's really paying attention, but for every email, you know how it goes, for every letter they get, for every contact they get from a constituent, they know that it's 100 other people who are thinking the same thing or more. And so even if it feels useless, even if you feel like you're, you know, getting nowhere, we have to crank up the pressure at this exact point in time, because we are essentially gearing up for an election.
Can I just, I used to agree with every word you just said, but I've changed my strategy slightly in terms of how much time people have. At this point, if you're writing a letter or an email to a Conservative MP, it's not worth your time. If you can get them in a personal conversation, you see a Conservative MP on the street, or you live in a Conservative riding, you just, you know, you bump into Joe Oliver on the streetcar, like that's ever going to happen. But speak to them directly. My view right now is that any letter or email to Conservative MPs just goes in the data bank they keep on us to know who we are, and direct robocalls to keep us from voting. So, you know, if you get in the mail the Conservative mailing who's on the right track on this issue, please be sure to tell them that you support Stephen Harper 100%. You think he's wonderful, and you'd give more money if only they didn't ratify the Canada-China Investment Treaty. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, letter writing to if you're going to have a little bit of time every week, I think educating the other Canadians and getting, and by all means write to Liberals and NDPers. They need to hear this. So do, you know, sorry to take them all. I mean, I've just come to the conclusion that every letter to Stephen Harper is a waste of energy. I'm so sad about that. It shouldn't be the case, but I don't see that those letters are being answered, and I don't think he is susceptible to the usual democratic impulses of a usual Canadian politician in our normal context.
Somebody else wants to know, is there any connection between the climate crisis and the attack on public health care? With regards to the cost increase, the thing, like, so as the idea basically, I think, is that has to do with because we have a public healthcare system. Is maybe the threat to the funding of our healthcare system maybe going to put pressure on any of these issues because we have to pay for it here in Canada?
I actually have seen some studies, well, not studies, but some research when I was researching Ecoholic Body. I was looking at the links between climate change and our health, and the increase in hospital visits because of climate change, increases in asthma, etc., increases in Lyme's disease because of ticks coming north. And Health Canada actually is studying the issue. At least last checked, it was even as I was writing the book, it was on their website how they were technically concerned. Whether they were actually doing anything about it was another matter. But I was surprised it was still on the website. They were saying this and making the link. Were they actually doing anything about it? No. I mean, is the federal government doing anything about it? No. But technically speaking, they are aware that climate change is going to increase healthcare costs. But they're downloading healthcare costs to the provinces, right? So they don't really give a shit.
Actually, they're abdicating responsibility on healthcare by saying, here's a check. We don't want to talk to you about it anymore. So the health accord that runs out in 2014 is not. But that I tend to think the assault on our healthcare system, the pressure towards privatization, is quite a separate impulse, although consistent with the same ideological impulse that says we're prepared to steal the future from our children as long as we make money doing it in the short term. In other words, it's morally bankrupt on both issues.
I think the question was asked with the understanding that this is more of a long-term question, but does a sustainable economy require sustainable economics? And I think what they're getting at is that is not capitalism itself potentially broken?
Well, certainly, Stephen Harper's economic action plan for expanding the tar sands is directly contradicting, the long-term life plan of this planet. It is not congruent with future life on this planet, and so sustainability of an economy, he's looking at the next 30 years really. And sorry, can you go back to the the question again?
I think as someone was proposing, basically is the problem having to do with capitalism itself?
Well, I mean, we talk about the consumer impact of everything we buy, and there is a dotted line between, everything that's in our households. And in fact, we today by 26% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from goods and services. And that is about 6% more than it was like 15 years ago. We're just buying more stuff. And our society around the world that we're perpetuating, what's the word, sermonizing and spreading the gospel on the Western way of life to around the world. India, China, everyone wants to live like the middle class here now. And it is pretty much a disease on the planet. And so, I mean, that's my perspective on it.
Just the word sustainable has been barred from all publications under the Harper administration. By the way, there is no such thing as the Harper government. When the media apes what Harper wants them to say, we should be contacting media outlets as well to remind them there is no such thing as the Harper government. There is the government of Canada. In any case, under the Harper administration, they have made verboten the use of the term sustainable development, and they don't like the word sustainable either. So the current, there are a lot of different economic systems on the planet. And the perspective Greens bring to this is our problem isn't whether, and it's a very funny question actually to suggest that capitalism may be broken because we could ask when was it ever fixed. It is inherently a system that cares only about a bottom line, and at one point under capitalism, child labor was okay until society decided, okay, we're going to have some regulations against that. I mean, capitalism, I think, is a system that can work within the planet's limits, and that's what I was going to say. The Green Party is more concerned about the ideology of endless growth as the goal of, and not just, we can have prosperity and more people employed and more businesses, more value chains producing that greater wealth. That's all consistent with sustainable development if done right. The problem is when you're completely committed to increasing the size of production in terms of energy and raw material use. And if you're doing that on a finite planet, you are headed for a brick wall while putting your foot on the accelerator. So it's, whether it's a communist system that capitalizes on endless economic growth and discounts the environment, or a capitalist system that does the same thing, they're both unsustainable. Sustainable economics is more locally rooted, puts people first, and asks the fundamental question, what's an economy for? Is it for the benefit of a society and all of humanity? We can nod our heads, yes. What is humanity for? Is it a raw material to go into a great machine called the economy and spit us out as used process at the end of making money for other people? That's the general understanding of economics these days, and we have to reassert, as E.F. Schumacher did, and as John Kenneth Galbraith did, and as many great economists have done, the problem is when you allow the market to be the master as opposed to the servant of human needs, sustainability, and social justice. And with that framework, we can have a sustainable economy.
So someone else is asking about the line 9 is exempt from environmental assessment. Do you know about if Ontario will request one? I will add to that, to carry that thought, what is the place of the provincial governments with assisting with this issue? Because generally, depending on what province we're talking about, various provinces seem to be a little bit more on board.
Well, just to answer on the federal side of things, just so you know, it's not so much that line 9 is exempt, is that environmental assessment law has been destroyed in this country. Everything's exempt. The Bill C-38 that passed the House of Commons in the spring of 2012 repealed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which, by the way, had been brought forward under Brian Mulroney. It's not like it was a radical thing that came from some kind of leftist faction, but it's been completely destroyed. The Replacement Act is so weak, it doesn't require environmental assessments of anything, and if they are assessed, it's now reduced them in terms of what the effects are of an the environmental impacts of a project are reduced to a study of migratory birds, fish, and aquatic plants. It doesn't even extend to mammals or ecosystems. So our current situation is quite bleak, and on top of that, the National Energy Board is interpreting these rules, which are also part of the same bill, C-38 Omnibus Budget Bill, that said that you can only intervene in this process if you're directly affected, which is being interpreted by the National Energy Board to mean you've got the pipeline crossing your backyard. So we've got some very large deficits of authorities and proper environmental laws at the federal level, and then it's up to the province of Ontario to do a proper review. And because I live in British Columbia, I have to admit I don't know whether Kathleen Wynne is inclined to bring an Ontario review, but I did see Gord Miller, Environmental Commissioner for Ontario, commenting there have been some very large carve-outs and climate downs from environmental protections recently in the province of Ontario.
One of the other questions has to do with Harper's throne speech tomorrow. They were wondering if you think, I guess we're just looking into the crystal ball here a little bit, if you think that we'll hear anything about either pipelines or Keystone XL or climate change at all.
Well, what I have heard him say is that it's going to be a talking up his consumer-friendly government and how he's going to be bringing in some consumer-friendly measures to win all kinds of voters over, like, what was it? Do you remember some of the ones he was
I don't
talking
think it was GMO labeling.
It wasn't GMO labeling, but it was equivalent to Ford saying that he was going to paint all the curbs red to keep, the parking fines from being accumulated. And so it was that kind of consumer-friendly movement that Harper has announced he's going to be talking about in tomorrow's throne speech. And so I can assure you that he's not going to be talking about, sustainable economy and connecting the dots between our consumerism and the tar sands, or our consumerism and the larger carbon footprint.
One of the more bizarre things Stephen Harper said since I last saw him end of June in Parliament was to say to Barack Obama, when it comes to Keystone, we don't take no for an answer. I mean, what the hell? Does he think he's going to reenact the War of 1812 the way he imagined it for us recently? We're going to take up arms and we're going to just go down there and we're going to tell them, by golly. I mean, it's just like, in terms of diplomacy, bilateral relations, forget whether you're a climate activist, an environmentalist, or just a really embarrassed Canadian. What the hell was that? So I expect, as always, the 2012 budget, I remember reading frantically through that particular budget to see if I could find the word climate anywhere, and stopping very excited when I spotted it and realized it said the investment climate. I fast read these things looking for anything. Stephen Harper is clearly, this is not a surprise to anybody, he has morphed Canada's national interest with the interests of multinationals operating in the oil sands. He has never, and there is no, this is an important point, there is no economic justification for this kind of lopsided policy for a national economic activity, that it's focused on jobs. Their mantra, I hear it every day, jobs, growth, and prosperity. And it's all about pipelines, tankers, and you've got to be kidding me. That's our strategy, is to ship out a raw product before any Canadians can have anything to do with processing it into a higher value product. We just got to get this bitumen out of here as fast as we can, as much of it as possible, with no possible plan, no energy security plan, no jobs plan. And he gets away with it because he's presented in the media as the economics person, and everybody else is what? The stuff we don't care about, like our children, the future, life on Earth. So it is galling to me that he gets away with pretending this is a good economic strategy, because it's not, right? It's a very bad economic strategy to decide that only one region of the country gets economic growth and everybody else gets the crumbs. And by the way, it's not all that good for Alberta either to have all the raw bitumen shipped out in pipelines mixed with this diluent stuff. So I expect to hear nothing. Tomorrow's speech from the throne, if you want to check the Green Party site, I've prepared the speech from the throne that I would be drafting for the Governor General to read when I'm Prime Minister tomorrow. And so you can enjoy a nice fantasy.
Folks, unfortunately, we are out of time for this section. I'd like you to once again thank very much our guests, Adria Vasil and Elizabeth May.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
So without further ado, we want to make sure we keep on time so we get everything as well. We do have a couple of gifts, though. Before you leave the stage, hold on right there.
While I'm waiting, just remember, every single one of you, promise yourself and promise me right this minute that you will do more on climate work after seeing this film than when you walked in the door tonight. Whether it's doing stuff in social media, whether it's writing letters to the editor, whether it's joining 350.org. If you don't have time, give your money to one of these great groups. Please ensure that there is a movement that grows in Toronto on Line 9 and on divestment, and we'll all be a lot healthier. Thank you.
And
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
all right.
Thanks,
So we're going to
Dan.
get underway here, folks. We're going to be watching a movie. It's about 40 minutes. It does not seem that long because it's really interesting, and I'm not just lying to you. I just watched it. It's really great, so I'm super excited. We do have a quick opening with Bill McKibben, and then we'll be getting right into it, so enjoy the show.